by another speaker, Michelle Garcia, who will talk for about 15 minutes.
Okay.
And then Ethan will go back.
Hi, I'm Michelle Garcia. I am a journalist. And I just flew in on a 6 a.m. flight from Cleveland. So I'm holding it together. I woke up at 4. And before that I was in Mexico City. I relocated to Mexico City in December to finish working on my book. And I was in Ohio at a conference on conflict resolution and peace studies, talking about a film I did, and talking about Mexico as well. What I want to talk about are a couple of things, mostly from the role of the press, because I feel like that's the area that I'm most comfortable with, and that's where I've done a lot of work to some respect. 3 years ago, in 2009, Columbia Journalism Review published my piece that was a critique of U.S. press coverage in Mexico, of what was happening in Mexico. So this was 3 years ago. And in it, I said that when Felipe Calderón came into office and launched this war against the narco, this was really warmly received by everybody, basically. He listed as his objectives the dismantling of drug cartels, the reduction of drug flows, and pacifying the violence that had erupted in different parts along the border, Michoacán and other parts. There was no mention of addressing issues like money laundering. Judicial reform would come later. But all of these, this sort of absence of a policy to process and sort of impose justice in this war was not discussed. Nor was the idea that you could accomplish 3 goals simultaneously. And what was the ultimate goal? What would the ultimate goal look like? I think for me, I've been collecting string on that piece for a while, not knowing I was going to do a piece, and finally there was a piece that was published out of the Midwest about some kid who had OD'd on heroin, and in it, the story laid it out that it was the powerful Mexican narcos who were essentially responsible for his death, right? For supplying this heroin. Never mind that this was a person already using drugs, who already had been in and out of rehab. And of course it's a tragedy that he died. But to say that the supplier of the drugs was responsible for this person who had been using drugs consistently for years seemed absurd. As if he had no free will. And that piece really got to me, and that was when I decided to start pitching this story, because it really showed what I had been noticing for a while, and that I think is an underlying issue. Mexico is known to everybody. Everybody knows Mexico in their minds. Everybody has an idea of what Mexico looks like and feels like and smells like, what people are like, because we've all been there, either in real life or through the amount of popular culture that's been built around Mexico. And what these stories showed and that I wrote was that we don't see Mexico as its own country. Is a theater to play out the aspirations, fears, desires, political motivations here. And that includes the idea that there's a drug war. There's no drug war. This is not about drugs. I get into these arguments with people all the time in Mexico about we should legalize drugs because it's the gringos who want the drugs and so they should have it. Why should we have to pay? And it's, okay, this is how this works. Drugs are moved to come to the market here. Yes, absolutely. That is something that seems to bypass a lot of people, even though it's repeated in almost every news article. But that does not address the fact that what is happening is an organized crime issue that is fueled by impunity, corruption, and lack of opportunity, massive unemployment. So so I think that I have an issue with I wrote a piece in Salon in November. I think he just showed you the picture of Mayo Zambada. I went to Chicago and I reported on the case of Vicente Zambada, who's his son, who's facing federal charges in Chicago. The United States has committed $1.4 billion to supporting Mexico. According to the federal indictment in the Zambada case, he, or the Sinaloa cartel, is responsible for moving $1.3 billion worth of cocaine in 3 years in just Chicago alone. So if you think about that the amount of aid the United States is committed to help to sort of supporting, whatever you may think about it, is 1.3, and that's what this one metropolitan area consumed in drugs, from one organized crime group. Gives you a sense of sort of the enormity of A, the market, and B, how much this is an industry that employs all kinds of people. And this is the number one, a really important issue. It is not just the people who are moving drugs. It is the people who sell food, who do the laundry, who buy, the houses. I mean, this is an industry. And if it wasn't drugs, this is what employs people. There would be something else. And in fact, the Zetas are, there's been a lot of talk about the Zetas. They move people. I mean, they all move people, but people get moved. People, DVDs, used clothing. It's organized crime. And I think that one of the things that has clouded an understanding of what has been going on for the past 6 years is that it is attached to the idea of drugs alone. And like the piece that I wrote in '09, the reason it was warmly received was because it was billed as this, well, we're going after the people who are responsible for supplying our kids with drugs. This is a good thing for the U.S., so it's a great thing for Mexico. And there's this idea that what's good for the U.S. is good for Mexico. The thing is that there was, it sort of, to suspend critical thinking in that moment. And what's unfortunate now, 6 years later, is people are really tired of hearing about this story. I think that there's a total burnout in terms of how many decapitations and massacres and mass graves and disappearances and all sorts of tragedy. I think that there is it's unfortunate. It is a tragedy because what has happened for the last 6 years is a human rights tragedy. The Mexican government has said that 95% of the people dead are involved in organized crime. Okay, so this logic means that, oh, these are drug cartels killing each other, right? Okay, but there's a 5% conviction rate in Mexico. 40,000 people were apprehended. They don't get processed. They get released because there's no justice. The justice system doesn't function. So how do you know? How do you know who the dead are? And I'm not saying that they're all like innocent people. They're not innocent. But whether they're involved or not involved, it's the absence of justice. It is the impunity that allows these people on the cover of these magazines to become so rich. When you look at the Vicente Zambada case in Chicago, and I wrote this as I mentioned, for Salon in November, I wrote a piece about him, and I don't know how many of you heard about this case at all? A little bit, maybe? Yeah. So this case made big news not only because he's Mayo Zambada's son, but because his attorneys mounted this amazing defense, amazing in the sense that it's just utterly fascinating, in which they accused the United States government of sanctioning drug trafficking by the Sinaloa cartel into the United States, saying that they were doing it with the support of the U.S. government. And this made a huge, big deal in Mexico and in some places in the U.S. This was like, the U.S. is going along with this. So I went to Chicago and I went through all the court documents, and I have that case to credit with the fact that I probably need reading glasses now, because it was an incredible amount of paperwork. But it was so, what it contained was a look at strategy by the US government in fighting this, whatever it is. I mean, I don't even know what to call it anymore. But in terms of pursuing drug traffickers and organized crime. And you see in one of the cases, this indictment against a very important person in this case, Humberto Loya, who's an attorney for the high-level capos of the Sinaloa cartel, that they were able to move massive amounts of drugs because they would pay off officials in Mexico. And then if somebody got caught, he would access the documents in the Attorney General's office and then doctor them. Okay, when you're talking about that level of corruption, that level of infiltration into sort of the official system, the justice system, how do you get out of that? And I think that as the interest, unfortunately, in Mexico begins to wane 6 years out, or this idea that the new administration is going to change the direction, it is now that the most important aspects of this death is coming forward. It's now. Because it's now that there's an idea that, for instance, most of the deaths, most of the confrontations between the US, between the Mexican military and the organized crime, the deaths were the bad guys. The Mexican military wasn't suffering casualties. And so this was this was just sort of explained by saying, oh, that's because they're the military and they're so good, right? And I'm like, I don't know. At the end of 2010, I went to a village on the border across from South Texas. And again, at that time, I was not really, I'd written this piece, but I wasn't intent on getting really involved. I found it to be really complex, and there was no easy explanations, and it's this whole very complicated issue. But what happened was, in February of 2010, the Gulf Cartel, and this is Zetas, February 20th, went in and along what is called the Frontera Chica, which is a number of villages and small towns across from South Texas, they took over these towns and battled it out. Supposedly it's for this plaza, right? Which is complicated too, that idea. At the end of the year, the Wall Street Journal ran a story about what had happened in Mier. And 2 days later, all the hundreds of people who had taken refuge at the Lions Club in nearby Miguel Alemán, where I was going that day, got kicked out of the shelter. Apparently it seemed that there would have been a huge embarrassment because there had been this mass exodus from this village. So we go to the village, which is completely shot up, and it was totally unlike anything I'd seen like in Juarez, where you saw like targeted shootings. So one building shot up, but another one's not, kind of thing. This was an entire town, completely shot up. It looked like a war zone. It was the saddest thing. But what really, really got me on that, from that trip, was the next day the governor and the interior minister arrived in Mier 2 days later and told them that they were going to hold responsible the bad people who had done this. These people had been abandoned for 9 months. Nobody went in to help them. 9 months. They sat there with no water, no schools, no pharmacies, no gas stations, nothing. While these 2 people were allowed to battle it out, and there was no government support. The people, villagers who I spoke with, came through and would tell me that they would see soldiers come through in the daytime, but it would be at night where these 2 would battle it out. And for me, that's when everything changed. Because the idea that you're going to focus on these sort of organized crime bad people overlooks where the attention ought to be placed which is what is happening, what is being done, the accountability of this. It also made a huge difference to me because my ancestors founded Mied in the 1700s. And I have cousins who are still living there. I have family who still live there. To me, Mied was this mythical place of my family and its origins. It was sort of like the Irish today have these villages that they say, we come from this village, right? Well, for me, it's Mied. And this was a place where, with deep, rich history for all of South Texas, ranch history, where the ranching industry was started. All the big ranching families came from Mied and Camargo. And this is a place so special. It's called the magical Pueblo Mágico for a reason. And to see it, I go back last year while I was reporting the Salon piece, and there's this fishing tournament going on at the lake. So I go out to the lake, and I'm there, and there's the television who are doing this piece about how tourism is back up in this place. And there's all these guys in back of military vehicles with automatic weapons and the tourism department. And there's far more of them than there is tourists, right? And I go up to the military commander, and I start talking to him, and he says to me, these guys, he's looking out to the brecha, the sort of peninsula that separates where we are, which is more or less controlled by the Gulf, and the other side by the Zepnis, right? And he's telling me, these guys, they have this messed up ideology, they're savages, they're messed up in the head, and you know what? We don't have enough schools. The poverty's really bad, and these guys come along and they offer them a job. And they say, you can have any truck you want, and they make more money than we do. And to me, when he said that, without taking a breath between those two ideas, completely captured the issue, which is, and I wrote this, it's like, there's this sort of disconnect between these savages and so forth. And there are people who are killing people, it's bad. And the idea of people are getting hired to do things that are really bad. These are just the sicarios, not to mention all the other people who are involved. I think that right now, the U.S. most of the U.S. support is in terms of military equipment and training, and there's a great deal of criticism about that. I think it's also one of the things to sort of figure out, which I think about is, am I done? Huh?
When you say about U.S. supporting military and training, where is it?
Well, okay, so what happened was, so we have the Merida Initiative, and most of that money was held. For some reason, this money, very little of the money was being released to the Mexican government. I have information that it has started to flow, in terms of dispensing more of this money. I mean, this was passed a while ago, and for some reason it was being held for a really long time. Very little of it was being released, and it's not financial. It's military hardware and training. I think that the dilemma is, if the United States is involved, you can have this argument about whether the United States should or should not be involved, and to what degree. I think it would be, I think there's no way the U.S. is not going to be involved in some way. It's just, it's right there, number one. But I think it is important that to think about where positive energy, if you will, could be applied. And there is very important work being done in Mexico right now for judicial reform, to start holding people accountable, to start having a justice system that works, to fix the impunity rate. And there's some interesting experiments going on, and I think that those are worth looking at. And the problem is that you have a choice between covering, another massacre, or the latest trend in narcocultura, or covering judicial reform, when you can imagine where the attention goes. Unfortunately, the nuts and bolts and some of the most important aspects of this is the most boring, unsexy part. But it's so critical. And it's so critical to be vigilant about what's going on in that respect. I just want to end by saying, again, I hope this all held together well because, as I said, I just got it from Ohio. 2 days ago or 3 days ago, General Charles Jacoby, he's the commander of the Northern Command, general with the Northern Command, said that the decapitation strategy in Mexico had no appreciable effect, no appreciable positive effect. So going after the head capos, that was the declared strategy some time ago, he's saying now, didn't work. The response to this was something along the lines of a line that usually ends with Sherlock. And I think that here we are 6 years later, reviewing a strategy that unfortunately did not receive the critical review that it demanded when it was first announced. And I would hope that we can begin to avoid this narcissistic relationship with Mexico in which in the U.S. look at it from the interests domestically and look at what's really going on internally and their way out going forward. Thanks. In this war was not discussed, nor was the idea that you could accomplish 3 goals simultaneously. And what was the ultimate goal? What would the ultimate goal look like? I think for me, I've been collecting string on that piece for a while, not knowing I was going to do a piece, and finally there was a piece that was published out of the Midwest about some kid who had OD'd on heroin, and in it, the story laid it out that it was the powerful Mexican narcos who were essentially responsible for his death, right? For supplying this heroin. Never mind that this was a person already using drugs, who already had been in and out of rehab. And of course, it's a tragedy that he died. But to say that the supplier of the drugs was responsible for this person who had been using drugs consistently for years seemed absurd. As if he had no free will. And that piece really got to me, and that was when I decided to start pitching this story, because it really showed what I had been noticing for a while, and that I think is an underlying issue. Mexico is this war against the narco. This was really warmly received by everybody, basically. He listed as his objectives the dismantling of drug cartels, the reduction of drug flows, and pacifying the violence that had erupted in different parts along the border, Michoacan and other parts. There was no mention of addressing issues like money laundering. Judicial reform would come later. But all of these, this sort of absence of a policy to process and sort of impose justice, the film I did, and talking about Mexico as well. What I want to talk about are a couple of things, mostly from the role of the press, because I feel like that's the area that I'm most comfortable with, and that's where I've done a lot of work to some respect. 3 years ago, in 2009, Columbia Journalism Review published my piece that was a critique of U.S. press coverage in Mexico, of what was happening in Mexico. So this was 3 years ago. And in it, I said that when Felipe Calderon came into office and launched
By another speaker, Michelle Garcia, who will talk for about 15 minutes.
Okay.
And then Ethan will go back.
Hi, I'm Michelle Garcia. I am a journalist. and I just flew in on a 6 a.m. flight from Cleveland, so I'm holding it together. I woke up at 4. And before that I was in Mexico City. I relocated to Mexico City in December to finish working on my book. And I was in Ohio at a conference on conflict resolution and peace studies talking about